a.m. to 10 a.m. The Hall Street Journal with your host, Robert Hall, and co-host Clarence Sanders. Fridays, 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Frank, The Success Principles. Friday, 12 noon to 1 p.m. Chanel's 3 Cents. Friday, 1:30 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. The Daryl Allen Hairston II Crime Victims Foundation Show, hosted by Daryl Hairston II, every Friday from 3 to 4:30 p.m. The Rush Hour with DJ Drew and me, every Friday from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. Different Minds Show, hosted by DJ Bam 640 and DJ Andre Michael, and your co-host MC Friend. Every Friday, 9:15 p.m. to 11:15 p.m.
And we win.
That's right. Ron Jackson, every Saturday, 8 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. Hour of Power with your host, Reverend Winters Rogers, every Saturday, 9:30 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. And again, the Prayer, Praise, and Deliverance with Elder Thurman Gorman Jr., Saturday, 11 p.m. to 12 p.m. And don't forget Four Sisters Live Talk, Saturday at 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. Turning dreams into reality talk show with your host, Tashika L. Green, every second Saturday, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Walk in Newness 24/7 with Missionary Antoinette, Saturdays, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. News, ULN, news and analysis, information, sports, and black history. With your news anchor, Roderick Carter Willis, 4:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. Step your game up with the Youth Project, hosted by DJ May and DJ Low Hefe, Saturday 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And don't miss The To Go Show with Kim Brown, Saturdays 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. I am Dr. Sharon Shaw, each Sunday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. Featuring the grind, Entrepreneur Network Spotlight, and Write the Book Now. The Riri Williams Show, Fashion and Style Hour, every first Sunday from 3 to 4 p.m. Real Talk 101, Sundays 6 to 8 p.m. And every third Sunday from 3 to 4 p.m., the Third Sunday Tea Talk Show with Dr. Akita Pearson. Gospel Live TV show with host Gloria Mello each Sunday from 8:15 p.m. to 9:15 p.m. Listen to all your favorite shows on VoxWave.com.
VoxWave.com, streaming your favorite jazz, blues, and R&B 24/7.
People say Featherson. Thank you. I appreciate that.
And as you can see, that camera is on me right now, so I'll introduce.
Sure.
And there is no commercial though, right, Ron?
Mm-hmm.
There is no commercial, right? It looks like you just.
Yeah, I just did it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
you keep going.
So right. So once I mention his name, if you don't mind, you can pan him into the screen.
Yeah, like I know you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you take the phone call.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. You first.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So you can see us right there, but you'll see us right there, straight ahead. But when you're talking to the viewers, look in the camera. You and I can always right. Yeah. So what I'll do is more like I'll just welcome everyone in. Oh, good evening, and welcome to In the End We Win with Kurtis. My name is Kurtis Austin, and I will be your host for the next hour. Thanks for tuning in. We look forward to another dynamite show tonight. I have a special guest in the house, and we're going to talk a little bit about the role of African Americans in today's society. I have my friend and friend to the show, Mr. Clarence Featherson, and we are going to jump right into it. Good afternoon, good evening, sir. How are you?
Good evening. I am Dynamite, and thank you for having me on. In the end, we win. Kurtis, thank you.
Absolutely.
Glad to be here.
So Clarence is an attorney, Clarence Featherson, by the way. He has been on the board of Return to the Source. And Clarence, if you would, just let our viewers know what exactly Return to the Source is.
So Return to the Source it was an organization in Washington, D.C., cultural, educational organization that was designed for the study, the advancement, and the promotion of African American and African culture. Okay. And the organization gets its name, Return to the Source, from the title of a book by Amilcar Cabral, who was president of West African country in the time of its independence. And he was the president of Guinea and helped steer them through fights against the Portuguese when they were a colony of the Portuguese.
Sure.
And then into independence.
Okay. And how long were you on the board there?
I was on the board for several years.
Gotcha. And from that, you've acquired, obviously, a ton of knowledge in order to be able to sit on the board, first of all. And I think that's ultimately why I'd like to have you on tonight, because I'm struggling. I'm struggling with understanding how we're still having unarmed black men being shot down when, in 2018, it just baffles me as to how folks can run into a church and shoot everyone up and walk out alive. And you have a young man who, though running from the police, in one instance, here recently, within the last 2 weeks, was named Stephon Clark out in Sacramento, running from the police, but ends up getting shot over 20 times. And they speculate that he had a handgun. That baffles me, and I'm a little concerned about that. So I just wanted to have you on to help not just myself understand, but our viewers perhaps get a better understanding of our role as African Americans in today's society. Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I think the reason you brought me on is I did a session at work for Black History Month.
Yes.
And the title of the session was, "In a Post-Racial America, Is There Still a Need for Black History Month?"
Sure.
And I deliberately titled it, "In a Post-Racial America," because I wanted to get people's attention. There are some people who believe because we had a black president who was elected, because we had a black attorney general, that we really don't need, number one, to continue to have a special month set aside for African Americans, and that secondly, that we have crossed some kind of threshold that now we are treated as fairly and as equally as other groups in America. Mm-hmm. And I think the issue that you raised shows that, number one, we haven't reached a post-racial America.
No.
That the killing of black men by police officers, in particular unarmed black men, is an example of one of the reasons why we need to continue to understand our history, because if we look at our history, what we're experiencing now is really not new.
That's right.
But what's happened is, before you had internet TV, before you had 24-hour cable, a lot of people don't realize, before CNN, which really took off during Operation Desert Storm in 1991 or so, you didn't have 24-hour news. So what would happen, a killing in the West Coast, a killing in Florida, we may not even hear about it until years, weeks, months later. And by then, it's just a few lines in the newspaper.
Sure.
When you see something visually, it affects you. It makes people who may not believe what they're seeing understand that what they're seeing is real, in real time. Rodney King.
That's
so
right.
Had it not been for Rodney King being videotaped, his
That's right.
beating by the hands of those police officers, then what people would have said is, he provoked them, he was the big black man who is always threatening and intimidating. And in a little while we can talk about that, because if you understand the role of the perception of black people in this country historically, we tend to be depicted as dangerous,
That's right.
as the outsider,
That's right.
as the person who is willing to cause problems. We are the problem. And so when they saw the Rodney King beating, even people who might have been inclined to give police the benefit of the doubt, which is usually what happens in this country, it was there. There was no denying it. And so I think what we're seeing now with 24-hour broadcasting, with the internet TV, with YouTube, with everyone having cell phones and video cameras readily available, we are now seeing the brutality and some of the unarmed shootings that have always existed, but that most people were not aware of. And you know, after I talked to you yesterday and you mentioned some of the things we were going to talk about, I just went to the internet and just Googled in blacks shot and killed by police officers. And what I found out was that it's essentially we're being shot and killed 2.5 times the rate of whites. So African Americans make up 24% of the people fatally shot and killed by police officers, even though we're only about 13% of the population. Whereas whites are 63% of the population, but they're only 49% of those killed by police. So what you're getting is a big discrepancy in the shooting and the killing by police officers of one group of people versus another. And one of the reasons has to do with how blacks are perceived in America, how we are treated, and the fact that we had a black president elected. For the regular folks on the street, for you, for I, that really hasn't impacted or changed the way.
It has not?
It has not. It has not.
Because we were going to talk about that as well.
But it is not in terms of, if you look, the police shootings, the killings, particularly when you have people, and I'm not second guessing policemen. Policemen, firemen, teachers, they don't get paid enough. And I think what happens is that you have a small group who make, they give the larger group a bad name.
Okay.
And what most people don't also realize is that in the course of their career, most police officers never discharge their gun once. Most don't.
Okay.
So you got a small number of officers who are in jump out squads, who are in tactical squads. They're in activities where they're going to need to fire more. But the question is, again, why this discrepancy between the number of blacks who are shot and killed and our numbers in the overall population?
Have you looked into why? Have you come up with a logical explanation as to why? Because I hear a lot of training. I hear a lot about training. What one agency does here on the East Coast may not be the same as what an agency does on the West Coast. So the training is not universal, if you will.
Training is not universal. But I think the police, when they go home at night, they take off their badges. They're people like everyone else. So they look at black people the same way that most other Americans look at black people. They have been conditioned by this society. I was stopped several years ago up in Wheaton, Maryland, and the officer said, first thing he asked me, I had never had this happen. And usually I'm very calm because I have had several incidents of where I've been pulled over for DWB, that's driving while black. But in this one, there was no trying to find a real justification for why I was stopped. The first thing the officer said was, when he pulled me over, was, "Are you on parole?"
Wow.
Not, do you know that you have a headlight out, that you're missing something? Are you on parole? Now,
so is it safe for my audience to assume that this was a white officer that pulled you over?
It was a white officer. It was a white officer. Now, I've had encounters with black police officers, but they're generally different. I have been followed leaving neighborhood stores where I live. And you know, when a police officer is behind you for about a half a mile, before you are pulled over, then you begin to say, well, what is it that took a half a mile? What is happening sometimes is that your tags are being run, your tags, other things, and is there outstanding,
That's right.
warrants, tickets, other things, and then
know what they're going to get into.
And then in Montgomery County, what happened is several years ago, because of incidents between police officers and a disproportionate number of black drivers being pulled over, the county agreed to keep track of the race and ethnicity of people who were stopped for traffic violations. So the one time that the officer followed me for about a half a mile, and I was pulled over, I was told, as usually is the case, there's a headlight that's out, or maybe your rear brake light is not blinking correctly. And so after my license is run through the system, I'm let off with a warning, but not a written warning, because the written warning would trigger a record for the race of the people who were pulled over and stopped. And again, and I'm not saying this is all the time. I've had some incidents with white officers where people have been polite and there was something legitimately, maybe it was a rolling stop.
Sure.
But again, I think in the time that I just mentioned, where I was followed for about a half a mile, what was interesting is when I gave my license, it showed that I lived in the neighborhood where I had been followed from. And then everything changed. So everything changed because, okay, I guess I proved that I had a right
to be where
I am. And I think, and again, this gets back to, is there still a need for Black History Month? Because what we see is, how have black people from the time we were first brought here been seen by the larger society, and the police officers and the way we're treated tend to reflect that. And I think we use history as a scorecard, a report card, to show where we've been, where we're going. And if you look at our history, a lot of the problems that we're facing now, we have faced in the past.
That's right.
So we tend to have periods of progress where we may take 3 steps forward, and then there's a backlash, and then we have to take 2 steps back. And so it's a constant struggle to make progress. And when we do make progress, in a way we're penalized for making progress because we're trying to get ahead. And I think some of what we're seeing also in terms of the treatment and the attitudes that are being voiced from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. If you remember, not several months ago, a police officers association was told essentially, if you're putting people in the squad car, it's okay to rough them up. It's okay to bang their heads. So I think officers are being told essentially that you have permission to shoot first, ask questions later, and that you are basically going to be giving a pass in a lot of situations because this is the mood of some of the people in power, and not everyone. And I think that in some jurisdictions that the community, the police officers association, the executives are on top of that, and so they're working to prevent that kind of mentality, because it only takes a few bad apples to make all of the whole policing effort seem like an occupation force for people when they encounter police.
Sure. So, guests, as you hear, we have jumped right into this conversation tonight, but I am also opening up the lines for you guys to call in. You can call in and join in on the conversation by dialing 240-719-2560. Again, 240-719-2560, and you can get in on the conversation with my guest, attorney Clarence Featherson, and we're going right along with it. Now, Clarence, you mentioned earlier about perception. How real is this thing about perception in the mindset of white America, in your mind, and our current president? Because I remember when he made those statements about it being okay to rough them up and so on. Even in those rallies we saw where he made comments from the pulpit. How do you view his role in this perception piece?
I think what he's essentially done, and if you've noticed, we've had more racially motivated attacks. We've just had more mass slayings. I think what's happened is one of the things that the president's office can do is be a moral compass for this country. This moral compass is broke. There is no appeal to people to put aside their prejudices, their racism, their bigotry, their hatred. If anything, they are being given permission to take out whatever sheets they had in the closet. If they haven't gotten sheets, if they don't have them in the closet, to go out and buy some. I bet no one's probably checked the number of records, but I bet you there's probably been an increase in the number of orders for Klan robes since the president was elected, and the companies that make them probably made in China, because very few things are made in America today. But they are probably doing a booming business. If you look at what happened in Charlottesville, and the woman who was killed was white.
Yes.
But what the president said when asked to condemn the alt-right, the white supremacists, the Nazi supporters, he said, and I quote, "There are good and bad people on both sides." Would you have said that with regards to World War II, there are good and bad people with the Nazis and the Americans? With the Japanese who bombed Pearl Harbor, were there good and bad people on both sides there? Right is right and wrong is wrong. And I think there's a difference when people who are marching against racism, against discrimination, against prejudice, than people who are marching to put those things back in place. And when you hear words like "Make America Great Again," well, what exactly does that mean? Great for who?
Right.
Great,
Definitely.
Great for who?
Right.
Right? As I look around the studio, there's a picture on the wall of our gang. And for those, given my age, who are younger out there and don't know it, go on YouTube and look up Our Gang. But what was different about that show at the time was they had a black character, and he was treated as a part of the group. But if you look at almost any other show in the 40s and the 50s, even in the 60s, it was like America had no black people.
Right.
So the Native Americans were portrayed by white people. The Asians were often portrayed by white people. And then you had a show such as Mayberry, Andy Griffin. And I'm trying to find out where there are towns in North Carolina where you don't even see a black person crossing the street, loading the bag, sweeping the stores. But that is the type of America that I think some people want to go back to, where African American folks, like children, really weren't even seen, let alone not heard.
Is it possible to get this equality? To get this thing that we're searching after?
You know, I think that's an excellent question. I think one of the things, and again, what history does is it gives us a best practices, sort of lesson to learn what has worked in the past. It also lets us look at where we've come from, where we're going, what we've overcome, and how much lies ahead to be done. I think, as the title of the show is, in the end we win.
That's right.
We will win.
That's right.
But again, I think what happens is, and this is why I'm really keen on understanding history, is for those young people who probably didn't grow up or understand some of the harsh, ugly racism of the 50s and the 60s. So they've never seen the signs white only. They've never seen some of the segregated facilities where they simply, and this happened in Washington, this DC, this happened in Prince George's County, Montgomery County. Montgomery County didn't have its first high school for black students until 1924, and then they only had one. They would pay, or they would have this black students in Montgomery County either come into, might have been Capitol Heights in Prince George's County, or go to the district. But the point is, in the past, we've had to deal with all types of oppression, hostility, and I'm sure people back then wondered, will we win in the end? But one of the things they realized is we have to keep persevering, we have to keep trying. And so for those who've grown up, and I think what happened is once people saw that they had a black president, they realized, because that was something I never thought I would see in my lifetime, that if we are able to reach that, then the sky is the limit. But what we also have to realize is, again, he was one person.
That's right.
There's a small group of black people who've done very well. And then there are a lot of us who are struggling and just trying to get to the next level. And it's going to take a process. It's going to take time. So we have been in this country over 500 years. A lot of people don't understand that the first permanent British settlement in North America was in 1607 at Jamestown. Christopher Columbus came into the New World in 1492. He was lost, thought he was in India, which is why the people are called Indians. But on that trip with this guy who was lost were black people on his ship. And not just as slaves, but as
He was
pilots.
relying
He
on-
was relying, and
That's
people.
right.
So the oldest American city continuously occupied is St. Augustine, Florida, found in 1519. America was largely Spanish before it was British, and when the Spanish came, there were Africans with them. They were soldiers, they were explorers, as well as slaves. And so that in terms of the time frame, we've been struggling for over 500 years for freedom, justice, and equality. We're making progress. There have been setbacks after the Civil War.
Sure.
We had a period of time called Reconstruction,
That's
where
right.
we had black senators, we had black congressmen, we had black businesses. And then you had, as you had after the Obama presidency, you had that backlash. That was when you began to really see separate but equal. You began to see attacks on black voters. There was lynching, there were bombings, there was domestic terrorism. People don't understand that what we're seeing now in terms of the mass shootings